Well, good morning. Professor Kent Lee here. Welcome back to Intermediate Writing or Intermediate Composition. Today we're going to talk about classification and comparison paragraphs and outlining a bit. So I had you look at some examples in the book. Martin Luther King essay. It's a short essay by Martin Luther King and a short, bit of a longer essay by Amy Tan, author of a novel called Joy Luck Club, which was made into a famous movie in the 1990s about the experiences of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans in the US. And we're talking about not just the forms of comparison and or contrast and classification paragraphs, kind of putting them all together, because really the classification style paragraph, it's not just a form you might have done in maybe a previous writing class where you did different kind of types or genres of paragraphs, classification paragraphs and example paragraphs and such. These all kind of go together, classification, contrast, comparison, because they serve similar functions. And it's not just the paragraph form for the sake of the paragraph form, but it serves a purpose in developing the writer's main arguments and main ideas. So for example, as we'll see in today's examples, the classification approach allows for comparison of different ideas and possibilities. It allows for the writer to describe a situation or situations in an issue. And in describing it, it allows the writer to develop his or her interpretation of the situation, of the things being classified. And in doing so, it allows the writer to argue for his or her main point, objective, thesis, or main idea. And to some degree, this allows the writer maybe to analyze things. Now, analyze, it's from Greek. The word analyze literally means to break things apart or break things down or break things away. And by comparing different possibilities, situations, aspects, it allows the writer to kind of break things down and to show at a deeper level maybe his or her interpretation of what's going on here, or to argue for his or her point. Let's take the Martin Luther King essay. It's a short essay. Nice essay. I wish he could have made it longer and gone into more depth, because he makes some really great points here. How do you respond to oppression? Well, King is, through this paragraph, through contrast and comparison, classification, he is arguing for his idea of what's the best response to oppression from an ethnic racial minority like African Americans in the US. So he goes through different possibilities and he shows the problems or strengths of these. The first one is when, say, African Americans simply resign themselves, so they give in, they acquiesce, they accept the situation, just accept the racism that they are subjected to, get used to it. And King says this is not a good option. Aside from the obvious facts that it doesn't get you anywhere, it doesn't give improve your life or anything, it's not a moral thing to do, because you're basically going along with and you're complicit with the oppressors. You're essentially helping the oppressors by simply going along and allowing the system to continue. And I think this is a great argument that really can be developed more, and it's relevant to today. When people criticize, social problems, and then they get kind of criticized for pointing out social problems and say, just deal with it. Critics say, just deal with it. And those critics are really being morally complicit with a bad system. Let's say people today are pointing out problems of sexism and discrimination. And then there's sort of this reaction from maybe people who are anti-feminist and say, just get used to it. Oh, it's no big deal. And those kinds of voices are morally complicit with problems. They're not acknowledging that there are problems, and they are being morally complicit. They're cooperating with a morally bad system by criticizing feminists, for example, who or people in the Black Lives Matter movement who are trying to point out serious problems in society, who want to fix them. The second option King talks about is violence. Understandable choice, but King makes more moral arguments here. He says it's not effective, it only brings temporary results, temporary satisfaction, and in the long run, it creates more problems than it solves. A very interesting point. It destroys, it tears down people, it does not improve people, it does not improve society. It's not really constructive, in other words. It's one-sided, it's not engaging with the oppressors, it's not engaging with maybe people who are on the sidelines and not involved. You're not engaging with society. It's one-sided, and it doesn't really engage with society and try to improve society, the entire society in a meaningful way. Third, what he argues for is nonviolent resistance. And he says this is the moral option. It contributes to society, it develops society, it engages with not only opponents, but also maybe people who are on the sidelines watching, people who are not really involved. It develops the moral strength and character of a nation. And by doing so, if we do this, we can be a positive role model, a positive example to the rest of society. And that was indeed true. I mean, well, look at King today. He's honored as a great role model and hero in the development of American democracy and in civil rights around the world. His movement and what he did set a very positive example. And in that, he is actually, I think, quite right. So he makes some interesting moral arguments here. Moral arguments for nonviolence. Now, by the way, in his I Have a Dream speech, he talks about another option. You could say number 4, what he calls gradualism. And let's just hope and fight for gradual improvement in civil rights, gradual changes to the law, gradualism. And King criticizes gradualism, kind of a gradual approach. And he says, one, it's really it's way too slow. It gives people false hope. And frankly, we have been suffering, we have been oppressed for hundreds of years under slavery, or in the past 100 years in America, under just other kinds of oppression. We have waited long enough. We have been oppressed long enough. We need to fight for our civil rights now through nonviolent resistance. So, in this essay, and also in his famous speech, I Have a Dream, he compares and contrasts different options. And he shows the problems with some options, the problems with some approaches. They're not effective, they lead to more problems, but this option, it's the best. And he particularly makes moral arguments as well as general arguments about the effectiveness of different options. So he is classifying different approaches, different responses to oppression, and by doing so, he compares and contrasts the different options, their advantages and disadvantages, and saying, especially on moral grounds, moral criteria, this is the best one. Nonviolent resistance is the best one. In doing so, he is not only arguing for what he thinks is the best one, he is also setting out his moral vision for the civil rights movement. So by comparing and contrasting different options, he shows nonviolent resistance is the best one. This is his basic argument in this essay. This is the best option for responding to oppression and racism. But in doing so, he really is establishing his vision for the whole civil rights movement and what it should be doing and how it should be accomplishing its goals. So a nice essay. I only wish he could have made it a lot longer and explored things in a lot more detail. But these are good points. Turning to the Amy Tan essay, so she is maybe less clearly a classification and contrast comparison essay, but there is some classification. So she's talking about different kind of types of English. Think of like a typical immigrant in the U.S. speaking broken English, and maybe she doesn't directly cite that, but in kind of implies a contrast between that and her mother's English, which is impeccable broken English. So we think of immigrant English as often being broken, it's not perfect, limited vocabulary, sometimes not native-like grammar, but her mother's broken English is impeccable. Impeccable meaning perfect. That's her perfect, impeccable broken English. And despite expectations, so in contrast to your expectations of a typical immigrant, this woman, her mother, is quite intelligent and still can express herself very well when she needs to, like when she's upset and she's complaining. Nonetheless, she can still express herself very well despite her language limitations. And her comprehension is very high level comprehension that's much, way beyond her speaking ability. She can understand, for example, financial news and fairly high level stuff. So her understanding is quite high. And in contrast, the author's own English is pretty good in polished academic or professional English, very good English. And she kind of compares her feelings about her English and how she thinks her mother feels about the author's English, comparing different feelings and perceptions, how she feels about her mother and her mother's English in different situations and such. She also kind of compares her experience, students, Chinese American students, and their experiences in school. A lot of Chinese American students will go for science, technology, engineering, math fields when they grow up, what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. And she, in comparison, went for English. And as she says, well, there are a lot of maybe other reasons for this, which I don't have time to get into, as she says, but it's been written about and it's been studied about. But her own impression is that maybe at home, a typical Chinese American student whose parents are immigrants maybe don't get a lot of English language support and exposure, so it's maybe easier for them to go into a STEM field. It's kind of her thought on that. So she doesn't really make a clear objective statement here. This is more of a descriptive essay, but you kind of read into it and kind of infer that she's kind of making a point that we shouldn't underestimate immigrants and their English and their language abilities. Their English is just valid. It may be seemingly limited English, but it's perfectly valid, and you can't judge them for their language limitations because, like this writer's mother, she might be very intelligent anyway, and might have a very high level in comprehension of English. So in these essays, the writers are classifying things and then evaluating them based on certain criteria. So what are their criteria? For Amy Tan, it's kind of more emotional or personal criteria, because she's kind of making maybe a point that you shouldn't judge immigrants and shouldn't judge people by their English. Perhaps it's kind of informal. So this is Amy Tan's essay is more informal, and she's kind of comparing feelings or comparing things based on feelings and perceptions and how people perceive things. King's essay is perhaps even more persuasive because he's using moral criteria. So he's evaluating things partly based on practical criteria, what will work, what will not work, and what will maybe lead to more problems than it solves, like violence. But ultimately, he is using kind of moral criteria for evaluating what is the best one. This is the best option. So he uses sometimes evaluative language, modal verbs like should. So sometimes evaluative language like certain verbs or certain modals like should, could, would. He also makes kind of predictive statements like, well, if you choose this, if you choose violence, or if you choose nonviolent resistance, what would be the effects, the results later. He kind of makes predictive statements about the likely effects or results of one course of action. Violence will lead to this. Violence will lead to more problems later. Nonviolent resistance will lead to social change in a better society. So he's kind of making predictive statements or statements about the likely results in order to evaluate which one is better. So he's using evaluation or evaluative statements here to argue for nonviolent resistance. So this is sort of an optimization logic. So let me explain that. If you took logic and maybe some writing courses, you probably learned about traditional arguments like deductive. You have kind of a claim and then you present evidence to show this is true. That's your traditional deductive argument. You make a claim and you provide evidence to show this is true. Inductive, you provide some details, some information, and you draw a conclusion, you induce or lead to a conclusion. Inductive, this is the correct result of this. King is taking more of a kind of argument that's done sometimes in social sciences and humanities fields, the sort of optimization, or one philosopher called it abductive. So inductive, deductive, abductive. Abductive is kind of a strange term. Has other meanings in other contexts that are quite different. In law, for example, abduction means kidnapping, so kind of a strange term. But he's basically making an abductive or optimization logic argument. Here's an option, doesn't work. Here's an option, doesn't work, or weaknesses. Here's an option, this will lead to the desired outcome. So this is the best option, sort of an optimization logic. If you consider the three options here, or the fourth one, gradualism, in his famous speech, which is not in this essay, the gradualism, he shows that, well, there are problems with this and this and this, but this one will work. This has the best chance of working. And so he uses classification and the contrast and comparison to argue for his point. Not only that this is the best option, but also to kind of paint his vision for the civil rights movement and our goals and how we should fight for freedom and fight oppression, the goals and the methods. So in classifying things, King, for example, has used evaluation criteria, like moral criteria for evaluating, for classifying things, and for evaluating them. This won't work, this won't work, this will work. So writers use classification, contrast, and comparison along some kind of criteria for classifying things and criteria for evaluating sometimes what is good and what is not so good, or what might not work. So these are ways that writers will use classification and contrast and comparison, paragraphs, essays, speeches, to argue for their points. King, in essence, breaks things down and he analyzes things by contrasting and comparing and classifying things to kind of analyze things. It provides a kind of a brief analysis, again, breaking things down, showing this won't work, this won't work, this will work. And that's how these writers, especially King, are able to make their points in these essays. Let me add a little addendum. Addendum is a nice Latin word, something that is to be added, something extra, little addition. I want to comment a bit more about logic. And yes, it's actually fun stuff. I know it sounds boring, but it is. But I'm not here to praise logic or anything. I mainly want to point out something where your past writing courses and other courses might have maybe given you something that's kind of incomplete or not very useful. And that has to do with what I said earlier about the King essay, Martin Luther King's essay, where he uses a sort of optimization logic. And it's actually quite common, but it's not really discussed in writing books. Because writing books maybe were traditionally influenced by traditional philosophy, the philosophy of logic, where maybe you learned a syllogism. So a syllogism is a sort of logical proof like this. Here's a classic example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. I know, not a very exciting example, but that's a very classic example from logic. This is your typical inductive argument, inductive syllogism, where you have different points and it lead into a conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And in your writing classes, you were probably taught this is a method of arguing for a point. And yes, that's true. This is certainly done in a lot of fields, a lot of times. But it's not the only method. Now, you may have also learned about deductive. You could start with a conclusion, a principle, and you then lead from that. Lead from, deduce is what deduce means. You lead from, go from there to specific conclusions based on a general principle. So you could start with Socrates is immortal. Therefore, Socrates is a man, and he is like all other men. You go from a general principle to more specific ideas based on that general principle. Like you go from an explanatory theory to maybe a specific case. Well, this is a theory of how life developed. Therefore, when we look at the specific case, this is what we deduce should be the explanation for this fossil. So inductive logic, deductive logic, they're commonly used in a lot of fields, sure. But there's this third kind, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, and that's the optimization logic. So for a long time, the study of logic and philosophy focused on induction and deduction, and that's maybe in your textbooks, if you studied any of this stuff, or in writing textbooks. Now, the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce came along and said, hey, there's a third kind, and he called it abductive logic, abductive inferencing. Can be called, and this is a strange term because, as I mentioned in other normal context, abduction refers to kidnapping. So-and-so was abducted last night. It's a strange term, but literally abduction in Latin is leading from, kind of like deduction, similar. But it's a more complex kind of logic, a complex kind of argument. You should be aware of because it's commonly used in social sciences and humanities. So, for example, you look at several different possibilities and you weigh them and you decide, oh, this is the best one. This is one kind of inferencing logic, the kind that's common in humanities and certain areas of humanities and social sciences. Economics, political science, for example. Here are different possibilities for what the government should do. You could do this and this and this, but this is the best option. You look at different possibilities and you say, this is the best one. These have these advantages and disadvantages. This is the best one. That's what King did in his little essay on meeting oppression. Or you have different explanations. How do you explain this problem, this economic problem? This economic analysis. Well, it could be this, but it doesn't really explain how this happens. And you could look at this possibility, this explanation, but it doesn't really account for this. But look at this third possibility and explains everything pretty well. This is the best option. And you see this kind of argumentation or logic a lot in different fields, in humanities and social sciences. Literature, you could say, well, the author might have meant that, but the author might have meant that, So this is I think this is the best explanation for how you interpret this part of the poem or what the author was intending to do in this part of the novel. So kind of optimization or inferencing based or best choice kind of logic. This may not be in any of your past textbooks, but this is actually commonly used, and that is particularly relevant to when we talk about classification, contrast, comparison paragraphs, and then later on analysis paragraphs, which are really kind of similar in a lot of ways to what we've talked about today. So look out for this kind of optimization logic, when you're reading essays and analyses in, say, an economics class, a business class, a literature class, some other social science class, it's actually pretty common and it's not really discussed in typical textbooks. Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back to talking about some of the exercises and examples in the book.